All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure with a full room like this, we're going to continue to have people coming in over the next few minutes. So if you have a seat open next to you, please be sure and signal that. And as you're coming in, please feel free to come on down as far forward as possible. And we'll keep throwing chairs out as need be. So there's a seat right here. Perfect. So hi, my name is Robin Dunbar. I'm an Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. CTL hosts this series, Award-Winning Teachers on Teaching, and I'm very pleased to kick off our winter quarter series. We have our presentation today, which I'll talk about in just a moment, but you'll also see in front of you a card that shows the dates and upcoming presentations. The next one on February 6th is Professor Hester Gelber on Getting Creative. So I hope that also draws you back in for another fun time together. And I'd like to move on now and introduce today's presentation, Professor Mehran Sahami. Mehran is Associate Professor teaching in the Computer Science Department and is also the Associate Chair for Education there. Mehran received all three of his degrees here at Stanford in computer science, and even as he then went into industry, managed to keep a bridge and a toe back here with the campus. For many years, he was a research scientist at Google. Also during that time, a lecturer in computer science. So kind of bridging that academic and industry world until 2007 when he became full-time on the faculty here at Stanford. And I think for many years after that, still continued to consult at Google. So this idea of bringing the industry and the academic together, which is so important in engineering teaching. So as you would not be surprised, Mehran has a very rich publication record and a patent record in the areas in which he's done research. That includes machine learning, information retrieval on the web, and computer science education. And he's always been, since he started teaching, kind of on the, I care a lot about teaching, I put some energy into it, and it's been rewarded. Even as a graduate student here, he won a departmental award for being an outstanding TA. He also won one of Stanford's most prestigious awards for teaching assistants, the Centennial TA Award. There are more awards to come, but in this introduction, I'd actually like to step a little bit backward in history. You're going to have to put up with this, Mehran. I want to go back to a time when Mehran was an undergraduate at Stanford. And if you read his bio, you will see, and I quote, in reference to those years, "I loved it so much that I didn't want to leave." Now, he's clearly pulled that off. But I would also say that part of what makes him the amazing teacher that he is his ability to understand students very deeply, to understand their joys when they're successful, but also the challenges, the struggles, and the doubts that they may have. And if you're not already familiar with CTL's Resilience Project, and in fact, the director of the Resilience Project, Adina Glickman, is right here with us. If you go to our new website, which we are going to flash in front of you as often as we can, teachingcommons.stanford.edu, and search up the Resilience Project, one of the many vignettes that you will see there is Mehran talking about his experience as an undergraduate. At a time when he had real doubts about belonging. You've perhaps heard it before from others, but was I an admissions mistake? Everybody else belongs here, but maybe I don't. I just didn't do as well in calculus as I thought I would. Turns out they're telling me I'm not such a hot writer, and I thought I was pretty good at writing. So it's this idea of bumping very early in his time at Stanford into expectations that were higher than he felt prepared for, grades that were lower than he wanted, and doing that juggle of, is this the right path for me? Do I belong? What's wrong? And with time, Mehran, as many of us do, took those challenges as an undergraduate, turned them into things like better study habits, displayed the resilience that we would like to see in all our students, and came to see these as opportunities for deeper learning. And I think that it's that kind of a commitment. Not only is this a person who has deep content knowledge, deep pedagogical knowledge, not only a lot of knowledge about computer science, but also how to teach computer science, but it's this part that also says, I'm connected to students, I understand students as whole individuals, including maybe the doubts and challenges that some of them may be experiencing and that I don't see on their faces. So if we fast forward from that time to today, there is more along the lines of teaching reward and award. He has been acknowledged as a Stanford citizen both for his teaching, his support of undergraduate research, and in fact very broad support of undergraduate education. And that was recently recognized in 2011 with the Robert and Ruth Halperin University Fellow in Undergraduate Education. And more recently than that, one that not too many of us are going to get to claim. In 2012, the Princeton Review named Professor Sahami as one of the 300 top professors in the nation across all disciplines. So a pretty tough crowd to get into and put there by student recognition. So that is something that I think, again, highlights the fact that we have in our speaker today somebody who not only teaches well, but who has reached the lives of students, and they've expressed that back. So from a possible admissions mistake to an award-winning teacher, it is my pleasure to give you today Professor Mehran Sahami and his presentation, Engaging Undergraduates in Learning, Teaching, and Research.
Robin,
thank you.
I think we should just say he was promoted. Mehran is full professor.
Full professor. Woo! All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Robin, for that introduction. That was really too kind. I should just stop now because it's all going to be downhill from here. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking with you about different strategies over the years that have come up for learning, engaging undergraduates in learning, in teaching, and in research. And so that's really kind of the outline of the talk, basically, is to think a little bit about some thoughts about student learning, ways that we've been fostering undergraduates as teachers in the computer science department, and then engaging undergraduates in research and some strategies for that. What I want to mention right off at the beginning is that this talk is mostly based on personal experience, not based presumably on education research, although there are some references to education research in there as well, but it's mostly just personal experience. And so what the real takeaway from that is, in other words, you get what you pay for, and this talk is free. Okay, so take it accordingly. Now, with that said, the other thing I really want to mention is that the reason why I got into teaching and the reason why, in some sense, I learned a fair bit about teaching is because of my teachers, mentors, and friends. And they're really the people who showed me the craft of teaching. They showed me what good teaching was by doing it themselves, by showing how to foster students. And if you will just indulge me for a moment, many of these folks are at Stanford except for one. So there's two people here I want to highlight. This is actually my high school debate coach, because she taught me how to speak. Like, not literally speak, but how to speak to a group of people. And perhaps the person who's had the most profound impact on me over the past 20 years, who's this gentleman sitting right there, Eric Roberts. So if you could indulge me for a moment to thank Eric for the exceptional job that he actually does as a teacher and a mentor. Thank you so much, Eric. And over the years, there's been people who've showed me about research. Daphne Kohler was my research advisor. Stuart Regis was a lecturer here in the department. There's other current lecturers and faculty in the department who have been people who we've just had lots of conversations. There are people who, some of them were actually literally my teachers. Some of them were people who were teachers in a more informal way. But it was that care for the craft of teaching. And so many of the things I discussed today I can't take credit for. Many of them were actually attributed to this fine group of people here. So let's start a little bit by talking about student learning. There was a quote by Herb Simon I heard a few years back. Some of you may know this, that actually really resonated with me. And Herb Simon, just in case you're wondering, is one of the few people who's actually won the top award in 2 fields. He's a Nobel laureate in economics, and he also won the A.M. Turing Award, which is the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. So it's pretty rare to have an individual be able to pull that off. He may be actually the only one who's both a Turing Award winner and a Nobel laureate. But one of the observations he made was that learning results from what the student does and thinks, and only from what the student does and thinks. The teacher can advance learning only by influencing what the student does to learn. And the reason why that resonated with me was it really made me think about the process of teaching as the process of getting students to do particular things, to think particular things, not in the sense of trying to indoctrinate them, but to think about problems and their solutions in a way that resonates with them so that they can care about why they're answering the questions they're answering, and get them as a result to think more deeply and hopefully learn as a result. So engaging students in learning. What are some of the strategies? So some of this is very kind of tactical nuts and bolts sort of strategies or tactical ideas, and some of it's more longer term strategic. One of them is just something that a fair number of us do, but it's often overlooked, which is the notion of thinking about the process that is going on that you want students to understand. It's very easy to get up in front of a room of people and talk about abstract notions, but the way those abstract notions become concrete is by understanding the processes that go on. And especially someone teaching computer science, abstraction is sort of one of the tenets of our field. And so slide animations, when we talk about something like, say, building a data structure, and slide animations are no great shakes, right? They're something that folks do. But there are certain things we could think about to make it more interactive. So there's this famous result in probability theory, the central limit theorem, and probability is one of the other subjects I teach, which is perhaps, I think, the most beautiful mathematical result in all of probability theory. It's just an amazing thing. And basically sort of what it says, at a very gross exaggeration, is that things in the world are just normally distributed. And it tells you why they're normally distributed. But when it's written in a textbook, it's written basically as an equation with a bunch of symbols, and students look at that and their eyes glaze over. And so one of the things we do is we just do a really simple way of doing an animation to say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to basically roll some dice. And I'm going to count how many times I get certain rolls of the sum of a certain set of dice. And so we can see that turns into a normal distribution. Well, let me take the dice and change them. Let me take dice that are skewed now. That should be something different, right? And we roll them and it comes out a normal distribution. Let me take something completely different. Let me take a distribution that's not just uniform like a die, or even something that I would think of as the sum of two dice, but something that can only be the values 1, 3, and 17. And I'll sum a bunch of those together, and I still get a normal distribution. When the students see that, you can talk about the different portions of it that are going on. And one of the comments that I actually got on a teaching evaluation that I loved started with a comment that I was a little hesitant about, which was, I'm not sure I understood all the math in your class. And there was part of me, oh, it's a math class. What do you mean you didn't understand all the math in my class? And then sentence number 2 was, but it changed the way I think about the world. And I thought, all right, I'll take that. Because you can still go look up the math later. You can look up what those symbols mean. But if you understand what those symbols are trying to convey to you about the world, that's what I care about that you get out of the class. Another thing is thinking about actually getting people involved in doing an animation. So I won't do it here. But one of the things is, when you teach a class of a large number of students, there's things you can do where you can actually have 10 students come down. You can hand them numbers and say, you know what, you're going to implement a sorting algorithm. And we'll stand there together while the students are shuffling around in the class and having other people in this class tell them how they should move around. And at the end, it turns out this random collection of numbers we had now has a group of students that are sorted. And there's fun things you can do with it. It turns out on the back of these, I actually write the word Stanford written out, in a bunch of letters. When it's sorted, it actually spells Stanford. Now it's just more like San Diego. But the animation always happens to fall on the week of big game. And so we end up sorting these numbers. And it's like, well, actually, the reason why we want you to sort is there's a secret message. It's who's going to win big game. And you have the students flip the numbers over. And it gets students involved. They flip them over. It says Stanford. Everyone starts cheering. That's always kind of fun. But it gets them to sort of remember the occasion and what they did. And little hooks that make them remember what was going on is even more important than just the process of what was going on. Because what you want them to take away is a change in their behavior and the change in the knowledge that they get from the class. So it's not just about presenting that information to them, but giving them reasons why they should recall it in the future. Along those same lines, one thing is that comes up is the notion of analogies to make concepts concrete. As I mentioned before, in computer science we deal a lot with abstraction. Same thing in mathematics. I think that idea is true in pretty much every discipline. And so we start talking about the notion of abstraction and information hiding and kind of these highfalutin concepts. And especially for students taking their first class in computing, their eyes start to glaze over and they're like, how do I put these things together? And I say, you know what? You ever made toast? And everyone's like, yeah, I made toast. How many of you built your own toaster? I could ask that question here. How many people have made toast? I'm just going to assume all of you. If you haven't made toast, you don't need to admit it in public. Okay? How many of you built your toaster? No one.
Only the fork over a campfire.
So there's this interesting phenomena that everyone has dealt with abstraction, which is I can use something without knowing how to build it. because someone else created this thing called a toaster, and they created an abstraction of the process of making toast. And I put in bread and I get out toast, and that's all I need to understand about the mechanism. I put in white bread, I get white toast. I put in wheat bread, I get wheat toast. So there's a relationship between what I put into this box and what I get out of it. But I don't need to understand what's going on in the box. And the students are like, oh, but aren't there little coils in there? And I say, well, there could be. There could be a nuclear reactor in there that makes toast in a second. There could even be Keebler elves in there who eat your bread and poop out toast. And you wouldn't know it. All you know is you get toast. And it's okay with you, because sometimes you don't want to know what's actually in the toaster. Live coding, this is something that tends to be more specific to computer science, or sort of the kind of classes where there's an ability to build something in terms of actually, say, writing some code or doing some process in front of students. And so one of the things we do, and people wonder, can you do this in a class with 600 students? Yeah, you actually can. And it's one of those things that makes a class of 600 students feel like they're in a class of 30 students, because no one in a class of 600 students would expect you to ask them to help you write a program. They think it's just madness. So when you do it and the students start responding, and you can just cherry pick the answers you want, because invariably there will be correct and incorrect answers. So if you're sort of pressed for time, you always pick the correct ones. And if you have some time to explore the incorrect answers, you can pace yourself appropriately. But you ask the students, I want to solve this problem. You tell me how I should write it. And then you just sit there and you write it together and you run it and you show them where the problems are and you add more stuff and you do this. But it's a way of taking something that is a large impersonal environment and drawing it into something where the students' expectations are, you would only do this with me in an intimate environment, so this must be an intimate environment. And it's this weird change of perception. Suddenly it doesn't feel like there's 599 people sitting next to you. The last thing is, a lot of people have talked about this notion of flipped classrooms. And the idea of flipped classrooms is, well, have the students go and, watch videos or read the book, and you can just come to class and discuss what was in the text. And personally, I find that a very intriguing idea, and I would like to do it except for two things. One is, if I just had students go watch video, or I expected them to watch videos, or I said, just go read the book, I'm not 100% confident that every student would actually do that before every class. So we'd probably end up spending a good portion of the class reviewing the material that should have been learned outside. But the second thing is, and I'll just admit it, I like lecturing. It's fun. I like to be in front of a group of people and talk and try to motivate students. I think that creates more of a personal bond and a connection than just creating a video. But I was really intrigued by this idea. So it's, can we do it without tears? And so one of the things we do is, in the probability class I teach, we still have class. There's still lecture. It's, just looks like a standard class. But instead of office hours, we have this notion of what we refer to as working office hours. And we have 40 of them during the week, because all the TAs have them at different times. And we tell the students the reason why we call them working office hours is you shouldn't come there just because you have a question. You should come there just to do your problem sets. Sit there and work in our office. And that way, if you have a problem or you have a question, you can ask it immediately and get help. And that becomes the flipped classroom. And what ends up happening is that students come, and the night before problem sets, 40 students will show up. You say, but that's insane. It's office hours with 40 students. Yeah, you or the TA doesn't have to talk to every one of the 40 students individually, because they have different questions, and they start to help each other. And that's what the process you want, because they learn the material better when they have to explain it to someone else. You're influencing their behavior that in turn is making them learn. And so that's the thing I love, is that when you actually get the students working together and explaining it, and then if they have, someone's trying to explain it and they have a problem with their own thinking, it will clarify their thinking to have to describe it to someone else and get feedback on it. The other thing I also love is in-class participation. So there's this problem called the two envelopes problem, and I will just take you through it. I'll actually do it with you right now. And so we can this is the actual setup I do in class. So this is the demonstration. So let me give you a little context. This is in the CS 109 class I teach, which is probability theory for computer scientists. And so they've already seen at this point some foundational concepts like expectation or means and conditional probabilities already. So if you're not familiar with those concepts, not a big deal. We're not going to get super heavy on math, but here's the basic idea. I need a volunteer. Come on down. Have you already seen this problem? No. All right. Excellent.
But I do have a math degree.
Uh-oh, that's dangerous. Tell me your name again.
Stu Levin.
Hi, Stu. I'm Mehran.
Hi.
So what we're going to do is we're going to have this problem where I have these two envelopes. Okay? And the way this is going to work is that you can have one. So you can pick either one. All right? So what I'm going to tell you now is good news. One of these envelopes contains $X and the other contains $2X. Okay, so that's the setup for the problem. Now you selected an envelope. Would you like to switch for the other envelope?
No, I'll hold on to mine for now.
All right, that's fine, and that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing because it was a random choice to pick the envelope. So now open your envelope. Both of them have green slips of paper, so you can't actually see the money, but inside the green slip of paper, what do you find?
Money.
How much money?
A tenner.
A $10 bill, okay? So now would you like to switch for the other envelope? That's a tough call. Let me give you a little help, okay? So everyone take a minute to decide for yourself if you'd open this envelope and you found the $10, whether or not you would switch for the other envelope. Think about whatever reasoning you would do, and if you're like, but Mehran, it's probability. I remember doing that like 20 years ago and I never wanted to do it again. That's fine. Let me give you a little guidance.
That was me, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good time. Come back. Take CS 109. So remember our setup, right? One of these envelopes has X dollars, the other has 2X dollars, but we don't know which is which, okay? So did you consider what's the average value that should be in this other envelope? Okay, because that should help you decide whether or not you should switch for it. Well, let's consider. Let's say Y is in the envelope you selected, so Y is $10. Z is the amount in the other envelope. I don't know what Z is, okay? But I could potentially reason that the amount in this envelope with 50% probability is half of Y, or it's $5. And with 50% probability, it's 2 times Y, so it'd be $20. And so I put those things together. If I put a 20 and a 5 together and divide by 2 to take the average, that's $12.50. So that's the average value in this envelope. Should you switch? Everyone says yes. Now here's the little tip-off. The equation I just gave you here that tells you that the expected value in that envelope is 5/4 of whatever's in your envelope didn't depend on Y being $10, which means this equation was true before you opened your envelope, which means if you picked your envelope before you opened it, there's Y dollars in there, and this is 5/4 Y, so you should have switched before you even looked in the envelope. Why? Think about it.
Let's skip lunch. I'm holding on to the 10.
So the news I will tell you, so before opening the envelope, you think either is equally good. So what happened by opening the envelope? That's the real question. Okay, I give this question in class on a Friday at the end of class. And I tell the students, go discuss it over the weekend. And their heads are so twisted around at this point that, you know, I've had students come up like in the middle of the weekend, they'll send me email and I've just been thinking about this problem for 20 days, can you tell me the answer? And I say, no, we're going to discuss it on Monday. Keep thinking about it. Keep talking to other students about it. I'll let you know at the end of the talk. So you can hold on to that. We'll come back to it at the end of the talk. In the meantime, you can still think about whether or not you should actually switch the envelope. So one of the things I also like to think about is teaching is really a performance. It's not just about conveying information, because a book can convey information. A book doesn't provide the performance, right? There's some reason why a student needs to come to a class rather than reading a book if you care about the fact that class in the sense of people physically coming together still matters for something. That performance can be students performing with each other if you want to have a discussion. But there's still an element of performance in it to engage students in the material and the instructor more than just something that, say, is a dead piece of wood, i.e. a book, okay? So thinking about bringing information alive, what are the ways where we can think about animations or thought problems, making it memorable, right? So it's one of those things that the toaster analogy I gave you, I'll tell you the story. I had one student who was actually in my 106A class. I saw him 15 years later at Stanford as a postdoc. First thing he said to me, I think even maybe before he said, hi, Mehran, was he said, a function is a toaster. He was a computer scientist. And I was like, that's better than hi. That's what I wanted you to remember. And making the students really want to understand it. It's the reason why they should be learning this material isn't because it's a degree requirement. They should be learning this material because it makes a difference for what they're going to do afterwards. And so that's why whenever possible, the relevance of what's being learned shouldn't be deferred. It's too easy to talk about stuff and then say, you know what, you're going to need to know this later. Well, sometimes later never comes. And if there isn't a reason why you need to know it and how it's relevant in the real world, and how it's relevant in the real world doesn't have to be a piece of technology. It can be, this is relevant to you because this will help your thought process. This will be relevant to you because it will allow you to carry on a more intelligent conversation about what Plato really meant. but how it's relevant to them in the real world gives them a reason to think about when it's useful and to retain it even longer, because it's that practice of doing it. It's influencing their behavior and learning that's what's going to allow them to really understand the concept and retain it in the future. And so along those lines, I'd like to say a little effort up front goes a long way on the back end. It takes real effort to make things look effortless. And I learned that from the teachers that I had. I learned it a lot from Eric. You go and see one of Eric's lectures, he makes it look effortless. You're just like, wow, how did you do that? Like, you could just come in and he could talk about anything for an hour and you would be engaged. And the reason why he does that is because he doesn't just come in and talk about it for an hour. He spent 40 hours preparing that hour to make it look like it's an effortless hour. But you do that once and you get to use it over and over and over again. And so, one of the great pieces of advice I got sort of starting out in teaching was, yeah, it's going to be a lot of work that first time out, but if you put in the work, next time it'll be easier and it'll be easier, and you can just leverage that over time. And so rather than starting out not putting in the effort and realizing you need to put in the effort, integrate it over time, you're still going to put in the effort. Why not just put it in early and then have a longer period of time to sort of make use of it? So that's the little bit about the learning side or the teaching side of things. One of the things I also want to talk about is undergraduates as teachers themselves. And let me start off by just giving you a motivation for this. These are the enrollments in our introductory computer science classes. So CS 101 and 105 are sort of, introductory classes really meant for folks who have no inclination to go on in computer science. 106A is sort of the big flagship programming class. If you look at the numbers, it's somewhat scary. Last year we had about 2,200 students take an introductory computer science class. You do the math and there's about 1,750 undergrads in a given class at Stanford, right? Which means not only are the vast majority of undergrads taking the class, and we've done the numbers well over 90%. It depends on how you count and a few other things. At this point it's probably well over 95%. But they take it not because it's a requirement, because they want to. And there's a lot of graduate students now. That's why that number goes so high. It's not like we had 500 people repeat the class. I actually looked at the number of repeats. It's pretty small. Okay? But when you're confronted with teaching 2,000 students a year, that's a whole lot of TAs. Okay? So what makes it work? And what makes it work, first of all, one level is just having a group of folks who really care about and are dedicated to teaching. So in the computer science department, we have a very vibrant lecturer staff whose focus is just on teaching. It's a career-oriented position. The average tenure of folks in the department is over 10 years in terms of the lecturing position. And also teaching faculty who not only are doing research related to education, but also teaching and education as a whole is their primary mission in the department. They do research into the domain of teaching their subject. But really, when we think about, how would you get so many people in, it's relevant content. It's assignments that excite students. People always talk about the notion of viral marketing. Well, we like to think of the assignments in our classes as viral marketing. Students should be so excited about completing the assignment, they want to show it to their friends. And their friends should want to say, I want to be able to do that. I'm going to go take the class. And unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, a lot of students feel that way. But the big thing is they feel empowered by what they learn. At the end of the day, we want them to come away saying, as a reason for learning this material, I can do something, I can understand something that I could not do before, and that will have an impact on what I do going forward. So the folks who actually make this happen are undergraduates. We have an undergraduate section leading staff. CS 106A, B, and X, the big introductory courses that have at least A, B, and X between them actually have I didn't show you the numbers for B and X, well over 2,000 students a year. They have one graduate head TA in each course, and then a staff of between 10 and 60 undergraduate section leaders per course, per offering of each course. So the staffs for these classes are, in some sense, larger than the average class in terms of students at Stanford. And section leading is an amazing educational experience both for the students and for the section leaders. The students get a much higher staff to student ratio as a result of the section leaders. But the section leaders learn to do better time management, learn the material better because they have to teach it to someone else, be extremely organized, and they rise to the role that they're given. So they're also cost effective. So just in case someone's doing the numbers, 150% in TA is about $8,500 for the quarter plus tuition. So all in about $17,000. You get 3 section leaders at 15 hours a week for $7,000, no tuition. So I feel like I'm selling section leaders. I'm not actually selling human beings, just to make that clear. But this is extremely cost effective. We just couldn't do it in terms of the numbers that we do otherwise. Caveat emptor, if you want to do this, which I would encourage everyone to kind of think about, you can't use university TA funds to pay for section leaders, so they need to come from other funds. There's just guidelines there, but feel free to send John Etchemendy an email and say we should relax that restriction. It would be good. So in terms of the section leading program, the program actually has tremendous benefits, and there's just two references I wanted to give you. One is from Stuart Regis, who was pictured at the beginning among the folks who were there, who actually helped launch the program in 1988. And I think really the intellectual center of the program in terms of evolving it over time has come from Eric Roberts, who's sitting there, who actually had a paper almost 20 years ago now about the benefits of the program and talking specifically about the Stanford experience. If you're interested in this, I'll give you the references at the end. There are papers certainly worth reading to give you a bigger picture of what goes on with the program. How do we actually do it? There's a competitive application process. There's only about a 15 to 30% acceptance rate. So if you figure Stanford has a 6% acceptance rate, and then 15% of that 6% are accepted to the section leading program, that's less than 1%. Okay, so it's very competitive. But what the students do is they enroll in a workshop about teaching and grading. The undergraduate's responsibility, the first quarter they're selected to get into this program, they become a section leader that first quarter. And they go to a just-in-time workshop to teach them about things like how to teach. They will teach a 50-minute weekly discussion section. They will grade all the assignments for all the students in their section. They will hold interactive grading, which means when they give the assignment back to the student, they just don't say, A, good job, or B, try harder, or C, not so great. They actually sit there for 15 minutes and talk about what were the pros and cons for each assignment with every student. And that level of feedback forces the student to think much more crisply about what they did properly and improperly than just, oh, I got a B. All right, well, let me throw that on the shelf and worry about the next assignment. They hold helper hours, or you could sort of think of it as the equivalent of office hours, where they're providing help in the trusted or layer computer cluster. They attend weekly staff meetings. Their total commitment's about 15 hours a week. It's a serious commitment of time. But there's a great experience for the students, and the section leaders, the students rave about the section leading programs. We do evaluations, mid-quarter, end-of-quarter evaluations. The emails they just send unsolicited. And it's just, for the students, it turns out to be, what I think is a really magical opportunity. I myself was a section leader, and it changed my life and made me want to go into teaching. So giving thanks. Here's a little picture. Might be sort of weird to see, and you might say, what is that? It is a turkey. And so this was an email I got completely unsolicited from a CS 106A student 2 years ago, where she wrote, my family has a tin turkey that every year we put a slip in on which we've written things we're thankful for. We've done this for 15 plus years, so every year we read all the slips in the turkey at Thanksgiving. This year I put in a slip in for the layer helpers. Remember, layer is the computer cluster on campus. For their patience, intelligence, diligence, and calm, they are really central to our learning process. They'll be in the turkey for years to come. And I saw that and I thought, oh, that just warms the cockles of my heart. And it did. It made me feel really good. What made me feel even better was that student went on to actually, the one who sent the email about the tin turkey became a section leader herself a year later. And her students, no doubt, are thankful for the work that she's done. The thing I'll also add is she's now a Marshall Scholar. So there's some, the 198 has some pretty high-profile alumni. Marissa Meyer, by the way, CEO of Yahoo, was a former section leader. They can go on. There's a long list. I won't belabor it here. So let's talk a little bit about research as well. Let me give you a tale of two students. So this is a true story, but names will be left off. First student, exceptional student, interested in teaching. Someone I know very well, phenomenal guy, just one of amazingly smart individual. He was engaged in a summer research program at Stanford. His mentor was unavailable for large parts of the summer. And the experience actually led to him deciding not to pursue a PhD. Let me contrast that with another student. Mediocre student at best. Interested in teaching, engaged in a summer research program. And his mentor happened to be Nils Nilsson, who was one of the people you saw on the earlier slides. Nils actually met weekly with the student, agreed to have additional meetings, went out of his way to mentor the student. And the student ended up pursuing a PhD, became a CS faculty member, and 20 years later, when Nils retired, the student was at the retirement party and talked about the particular mentorship experience he had because it was still that vivid 20 years later. And that student also even brought up the experience in a CTL talk. So it makes a difference. That experience makes a difference for the long-term career trajectory for students. It's not something that, yeah, maybe it works out or maybe it doesn't. The time that's put into it actually makes a real difference. So let me give to you, again, this is personal experience, what I think are the top 3 factors for a positive experience from research. Number 3 is the level of preparation of the student. That's the thing we tend to sometimes really put the most emphasis on. Are they prepared? Do they have the right classes, the right background? But that's number 3. It's still important. Number 2 is the motivation of the student, right? A really motivated student, if they're gung-ho, they're going to do some good work, hopefully, especially if they're well prepared and they're motivated. But what's number 1? Any idea? Yeah, the amount of time and attention the mentor gives to the student. Because when you do number 1 helps increase number 3. It helps make the student more prepared, and it promotes the motivation of the student because the student sees that you're taking the time to actually help them grow. And so they can come in not being entirely the best prepared student, and maybe on the motivation side they might be really interested, but it's unclear which direction it's going to go. They need the time to guide it in the right direction. Now here's the paradox. The paradox is we tend to spend more time with the stronger students because they're the ones who are achieving all the results, right? But they're the ones who really need less of our time. And so it's this weird conundrum to get into sometimes where, especially if you're mentoring, multiple students, there are some ones that are doing really well. Let's meet more often. Let's do more stuff. And the ones who are not doing so well, it's like, well, let's try to figure out some way for you to get through it, right? And so there's this interesting paradox that goes on, but it's not something that is, irretrievably lost. It's just a matter of how time is managed. It's not an easy thing to do. It's just something to think about. I'll actually refer to a little research on undergraduate research. So the Summer Undergraduate Research Survey, something called SURE that was done a few years back, where they surveyed students who were involved in undergraduate research across a large number of universities in the United States. And they found that the learning gains correlate directly with the evaluations of the students' mentors. So it was not just I had a good relationship with the mentor, but that actually impacted how much the student felt they actually learned in the process. The relationship matters. And not only does that relationship matter at the time of the mentorship, it gets amplified as a result over time. So one of the things the SURE folks did was after the students completed the survey, they did 2 surveys. They did one survey right when the students had finished their research project. And then the students were contacted 9 months later with a follow-up survey. And what they found, which was very interesting, was the results indicated the students' longer-term recollection of the experience slightly magnified their short-term evaluation of the learning experience. What does that mean? What that means is the students who enjoyed the experience reported even higher scores on the follow-up survey. They liked it when they did it, and they remembered it even more fondly later. And the students who did not enjoy the experience actually reported slightly lower scores, which means there's a long-term trajectory going on. It wasn't just the experience they had, but over time they re-evaluated that experience and amplified it, either for good or for bad, right? I'm an example. 20 years later, that experience was so amplified to me that it was the big thing that came out when Nils actually had his retirement party to go talk about that experience in terms of undergraduate mentorship, because it marinated for 20 years. So part of it's also setting expectations, and this is just some of the tactics, the nuts and bolts. So none of this is rocket science, okay? Just be upfront. So set deliverables for students to achieve. Do it early. Discuss at the start of the research what they are trying to achieve in the research. And I always like to set a concrete goal. And at Google, we had sort of different goals than at Stanford, so it was sort of different in the 2 cases. I'll give you an example from each case. At Google, when the student would come in, I'd sort of get a sense for what kind of thing do they want to do? Do they want to do something more researchy that maybe would potentially result in a paper or a patent? Or do they want to build a lot of stuff that's going to result in some prototype for something new or add to an existing product? Stanford, prototyping and product is not something I really think about, or patents. So it's really about, you want to create a coherent body of stuff that you think is compelling enough that you'd want to tell someone else about it, whether that be in a paper or a poster, or you build a prototype for something new that you would want to show other people. Here's something I built which achieved something that we couldn't do before. Okay? And so there's a real discussion about what the student wants to achieve, not what the goal of the research project is from my standpoint, but what does the student want to get out of it by the end? And so can we craft something that's flexible enough that the student can get the learning that they want out with respect to what goal they're trying to achieve, and hopefully have some positive experience, that the deliverable that they produce at the end is trying to push them toward that experience. And so it also helps clarify what's important to the student. Okay, so what would they enjoy doing? What do they want to get out of this experience? It's interesting because I had students who would come in and we'd talk about, oh, how about this research project where we're going to write some paper and we could potentially publish that somewhere. And they said, no, I'm just interested in building a bunch of stuff. And so very early on, that first conversation, it was, okay, let's figure out what to build then. Paper is not something we're going to worry about, but what's the thing you want to build and how is it going to be intellectually stimulating? How is it going to be something that's going to really push the boundary of knowledge that you know? And then give the students an audacious goal to achieve, which is always this weird thing. But I found that students just rise to the challenge they are given or not. In the sense that there has been students, where I just gave them this goal. I was just like, yeah, this is outrageous. I don't really expect them to be able to pull this off, but this is what we're going to shoot for. And we'll adjust as the summer goes on. The amazing thing was, like, they just hit all the milestones. And I never told them at the end, it's like, I wasn't really expecting you to be able to do all that. I just said, good job. Outstanding. And I've had cases where I didn't do such a good job in terms of preparing, and it wasn't really clear what some of the goals should be as much, and not that much got accomplished because the expectation just wasn't there to do much. There's also this notion of planning for soft success, right? If there's some hard goal and it's like we don't get to that goal, sorry, it was just a failure, right? That's really demotivating for students. What are the soft successes along the way where even if you don't get to the final goal you want, the place they still get to is something that it can be considered an achievement and an accomplishment, even if it's a negative result. And it's always important to distinguish between a negative result and a failure, because a negative result is not a failure. It's just a result that was negative. And it's still worth writing that up. One of the experiences I had with that very much resonates in my mind was one of the first research projects I actually did with Nils. I was trying to come up with this new algorithm to do something, and it was basically a failure. Like, it did not work. And so I wrote Nils this email, and I said, well, this is where we're at. And he said, I want you to write it up. And I was a little bit surprised, and I thought, oh, this is just busy work. He wants me to write it up. And he said, no, write it up. You'll understand why the failure happened better as a result of writing it up. And as I was writing it up, I realized that I'd made a mistake in my code, and I'd flipped two variables, an x and a y. And as a result of the write-up, I never would have thought and gone back and visit this. I went back and I flipped the x and the y, and everything just worked. And I sent Nils an email. I said, well, things work now. What should I do? And he said, write it up. So part of maintaining that motivation is the milestones. And having real weekly tasks where a student feels like they're accomplishing something, and it should be something concrete. It could be something like read a paper and be ready to discuss it by next week. Or contribute, this again a computer sciencey one, contribute to an existing code base. And that can even be something as like adding or creating documentation. Just understand what's going on in a system so that you can then extend it later. Run an experiment, write up some insight or result based on some smaller accomplishment that was potentially achieved that week, just to get them in the habit of consistently thinking about producing something new. And then setting the milestones is important. It gives the students motivation to get things done. Students won't pull an all-nighter unless they feel like there is something they need to deliver. Not that I want to have them all do all-nighters all the time, but they get a lot more done when they do. Show students that you really care about the work that's being done, right? If you have an expectation for them to bring in something and to discuss it, then that shows that I care that you actually did this or not. It's not just, yeah, whatever, if you did it, that's fine, if not. And it keeps you engaged in the work because it gives you expectations about how to take the next steps. And again, these are ideals. I can't say I do these all the time or that I always do them well or whatever the case may be. It's what I try to strive for. So this is aspirational. So let me give you two examples. There was a student named Andrew who was an intern with me at Google a couple years back. He was a math major, and he had actually very little programming background. He was interested in using math in neat ways, and it was sort of unclear to him what it was a neat way, but something new that he wanted to learn about math. I was interested in building a product. I said, we got a team, we're working on search for TV shows, sort of like a TV guide on steroids kind of thing. And he wanted to do math in neat ways, and I was like, how do we take TV search and get math in neat ways? And so what we decided on was we agreed that we'd be building a prototype that was related to TV, but it had features that required mathematical sophistication, that actually required new algorithms, that required doing math as part of the algorithms. And the result actually that Andrew got out of it was a patent on using information theory to determine who someone's television program provider was, right? So if you go and you search on TV, how does Google know which cable provider you have? It doesn't most of the time, unless the NSA is listening, but most of the time it doesn't actually know. How do you know which cable provider you have? The average person doesn't know, like, oh, I have, Comcast Digital X plus Y. But they can go look what's on channel 10. And so that's what this does. It finds out the most informative channel to look at any given point in time and says, just turn your TV on, put it at this channel, which show is on? And if I can find the maximally informative channel at any given time using information theory, I can find out who your cable provider is without having to explicitly ask you for it. But that's a critical part of knowing what to search for in your TV listings. And so in fact, there was a patent that was granted on this. And one of the things I always think is important is Andrew's the first author on that patent, even though alphabetically it would be reversed. And part of that you could think about, who did more intellectual content in the patent or not. And part of it is just students aren't necessarily aware about order of authorship or about how credit is assigned or not assigned in academia. And one of the things that's important, I think, as the mentor to always keep in mind is how to do that credit and assignment in a way that's ample for the student, or actually in some sense more than ample for the student. Because this is something he was really proud of. And it was something he could show to other people that, when he went out for employment, he's first author on a patent. So let me tell you another story about Katie and Sarah. Katie and Sarah are two students here. They did a CURIS summer research project with me. CURIS stands for Undergraduate Research in, and what's it in? It's in CS, because it's sandwiched right in the middle of CNS. So that's where the name comes from. And it was the summer after their sophomore year. Okay, so they're sort of halfway through their Stanford experience, but pretty early on. What we were all interested in was researching factors that impacted women's choice of whether or not they majored in computer science or not, because as many of you are probably aware, computer science has somewhat of a gender imbalance. It's actually gotten pretty good. Last quarter, of the 100 students who declared computer science, almost a full 30%, 29% were women, which is the highest I've seen in quite some time, maybe ever. So they sent out a survey to 2,500 students. 500 of them actually responded. They got 7,000 transcripts, actually more, from the registrar's office. Went through and did a bunch of things to actually pull out particular data we were looking for. They were anonymized, don't worry. And they also helped identify a new statistical model for analysis. So in my head, I had this idea for, like, if we actually want to do this, just reporting percentage is not the right model. We need this new statistical model. So I was sitting there talking to them about, here's the properties of the model that we want to have, and we should, develop this together. And later that night, Sarah Evans, so I should tell you this is Katie Redmond and Sarah Evans. Sarah sends me an email saying, yeah, that model you talked about. And I'm sitting there, like, trying to derive the moments of this distribution. She says, is it this? Or is it like this? And she points me to this page that describes this distribution. I start reading it, and the response I wrote to her is, no, it's not like that. It is that. I had no idea. It's called Fisher's non-central hypergeometric distribution, just in case you're wondering. Anyone heard of that? You had? Yeah. Really? All right, let's talk afterwards. She found it. She understood how it was appropriate for the model, and she was the one who could actually say, yeah, you know what? You don't need to do all this work because it's already been done. And I was sitting there trying to, little faculty thing, just trying to rederive it from first principles rather than actually going and reading literature. I asked our department, by the way. No one in our department had heard of that distribution. Okay? So the goal was let's write a research paper with analysis of the results and talking about this new model. And in fact, they published last year at the ACM SIGSI Computer Science Education Conference, which is sort of the big premier conference in computer science education, a paper about a large-scale quantitative study of women in computer science at Stanford. Katie was there to give the presentation when she was there was a panel with 3 papers. After she gave her presentation, the next presentation was someone who was actually a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon who was talking about some of their results, and she got up and she said, in light of the results from the previous paper, we need to go back and reanalyze our data because we should be looking at it with this different statistical model. And then at the end of the conference, the paper was well received at the time it was given, but there was a keynote from Jane Margolis, who's a well-known researcher in women in computer science education, who actually, in her keynote address at this conference of like 1,200 people, referred to the work that Katie and Sarah had done. So I was pretty happy. It was kind of a cool thing. And I think they felt pretty happy about the fact that they were sophomores. They were now part of a community of people that were really caring about and doing work in how to promote women in computer science and computer science education more broadly. So there's the social relationship aspect that I alluded to before. Here's a little quote that comes from, again, the SURE survey that Lopato had. There's a couple papers, I'll give you references at the end, who'd analyzed the data from the summer undergraduate research experiences. who said, these interpersonal relationships are just as important to me as the research itself. Unfortunately, this came from someone who gave this response in the context of explaining why the student was planning on leaving a career in science. So having a good relationship with a student is important, not just to excite the student, but because if that relationship's bad, it can have permanent impact in terms of what that student does longer term. So here are some of the references I promised you. There's a couple of the papers by Lopato that look specifically at undergraduate research. And there's the Regis paper and Eric's paper on the use of undergraduate teaching assistants in introductory classes. So if, especially Eric's paper, I think, covers sort of the development of the program in a very concrete way that makes it useful to be able to understand how to do this going forward with other groups. So then there's that 2-envelope thing. Okay. So, anyone want to venture a guess as to whether or not you should switch or not?
Switch. Well, I was thinking about that deeply.
Okay, and thank you. Thanks for humoring me. What did you think about it?
Okay. There's the classic dictum, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, and this was exactly 2 in the bush in that sense. I buy his probability argument that I'm either going, if it was $15 versus $5, then it'd be 50-50, why should I switch? But if it's $20 versus $5, I probably ought to switch if it maximizes my expectation. However, I'm retired. I have no other source of income per se. So the value proposition changes that. Then the amount of the money starts becoming important. So if I were to try to explain to my wife that I had $10 and then just turned it in and got 5, she would be unhappy. So I will stick with the 10 even though I know probabilistically I would have ended up ahead of the game.
Great, great. So you can keep that 10. Thanks for participating. Do you want to know what was in the other envelope? All right, I'll tell you in just a second. So let's figure out mathematically. So there's this very important notion that was brought up, which is the notion of what's the value of money to someone. And that's a critical part of the problem. I'm actually going to sidestep that part of the problem and just think about mathematically where did this paradox come up, where we think that the envelope we should just switch regardless of what the value is in there. Okay? So remember the two envelope setup. One contains $X, the other contains 2X. And we said, well, what's the expected value of the money in the other envelope? And Y was the $10, Z was the value in the other envelope. And I sort of took you down this garden path where I said, well, it's 50-50, right? It's 50-50 that the other envelope has either Y over 2 or 2Y in it. For that to be true, there's a very subtle phenomena that would have to happen. For that to be true for any value of Y, right? Before you open the envelope, you think either is equally good. So what happened by actually opening the value of the envelope? You gained information that would allow you to solve this problem. This computation here is a garden path computation. What I mean by that is it's not true for all values in the envelope. It assumes that all possible values that could have been in the envelopes are equally likely. Okay, which means there could have been $1 million in that envelope, or $2 million, or $1 billion. There's never going to be $1 billion in the envelope. Okay? There's infinitely many values that could have been in the envelope. The problem with that, though, is a probability. If you sum it over all the values, it's a probability. It has to sum to 1. That's what makes it a probability. Question? X is the value in the envelopes. One is X, the other is 2X. Thanks. And so you actually, this is another little strategy for keeping folks motivated. Because that distribution can't hold. It can't be possible that all values are equally likely because there's no way to have a constant function over all values that integrates to 1. It just doesn't exist. So if that's the case, then the question that comes up, okay, well, what is your distribution? You must have some distribution for what you think is in the envelopes. And so there's some implied distribution over X in that garden path computation that I gave you that's not a true distribution. So what is our distribution over X? Okay? There's a school of probability, and the whole point of this talk and this example is I want students to think about different views of understanding what a probability represents, because most people are sort of shocked to hear that there is not just one interpretation of what a probability means. There's a classical notion, which is the frequentist notion, which is the notion of a long-run chance of something happening. If I were to play a game over and over, how many times, what fraction of times do I win versus lose the game? That would be the probability of winning the game. So the frequentists say, hey, I want to play that game infinitely often and see how many times I see different dollar values. I'm not going to let you play that game infinitely often because I lose every time we play. So I only let you play once. So you don't get to see infinitely many values and do a long-run frequency count. There's another school of thought in probability, which is a Bayesian probability. And a Bayesian probability says that probability is a subjective belief. And that's one of those things that when you tell students after 7 weeks of giving them a whole bunch of math around probability, and you say, you know what, this thing, yeah, we've been doing all these numbers, all this math. This is a subjective belief. They're like, what? No, that's why I like math, because it's not subjective. So how do you get them to believe that it would have to be subjective, right? You have some prior belief of the distribution of x or anything else for that matter. And if your prior belief, that means before you opened the envelope, before you knew anything, you knew there's probably not going to be $1 billion in the envelope, or there's not going to be, Ben Bernanke notwithstanding, there's not going to be $1 trillion in the envelope because we just don't have that much cash, okay? So they would assign 0 probability to that, which means you have some belief about what the distribution is before you saw any data. That's your prior belief. If your prior belief is subjective, by extension, all probabilities, even after you see data, are still subjective because they incorporate that prior belief. Okay? So it's that prior belief that actually allows us to answer questions like, if I had some coin, I were to flip it, what's the probability of it coming up heads? Especially if you've never seen me flip that particular coin before. You say, well, I have some prior belief about how coins flip and physics and all this other stuff. So you can say 50-50, even without witnessing it. Okay? So the Bayesian has a prior distribution for what x is, and there is no inconsistency. What that means is you believe there is some range of values which would be reasonable to be in that envelope. And as the values get larger, the probability of some of those values probably gets smaller, and at some point it's just 0 because you don't believe I'm going to put $1 billion in the envelope. There's other things in your belief too, like the fact that it's probably going to be US currency. And if it's US currency, chances are it has to be an integer value with respect to at least the number of dollars and cents. Okay? That's also encoded in your probability. So y is the envelope you selected, z is in the other envelope. You open your envelope to determine what y is, and you say, is y greater than my expected value of what's in the other envelope, subject to what I believe about the possible distributions of the dollar values? Now I have a distribution that it's not 50-50 anymore, because you might think it's extremely unlikely for me to put $200 in an envelope. You open an envelope and find $100. You think a 50 is probably much more likely than the 200 because you subjectively give them different probabilities. And so the value you see, is that higher than what you would have expected given that you saw this value? If it is, then you keep the envelope. Otherwise, you switch, and there's no inconsistency as long as that prior belief actually exists. And so what opening the envelope actually gives you is it gives you data about where on that distribution you potentially are to allow you to make your decision. Okay? Of course, there's the issue of how you determine your prior distribution. That's the thing students always ask. Well, if I have to have this prior distribution, how do I get it? Say, it's yours. It's subjective. I don't tell you how you get it. You get it. You've existed in the world for some period of time. You actually get it. And so the Bayesian would say it doesn't matter how you got it. All that matters is you have to have it. And if you have to have it, then you have to interpret probability as being subjective. And that's the shift in worldview. So let me give you the super simple example. Let's say you open the envelope and there was $17.51 in it. Should you switch? Why? Because you can't get half a penny. At least not today. And if you got half a penny, you would get a half cent, which was last minted in 1860 and is worth about $150. So because you have that belief that half cents don't exist now. And so that has to come into play in your computation. So that's the 2 envelopes problem. Just to wrap up, hopefully, that was, and if it wasn't clear, you're like, I'm not going to believe anything he says. He doesn't know anything about teaching. But thank you very much for your attention. If there's any other questions or discussion, I'd be happy to do that now. Eric.
Don't we know that the other envelope has to contain 20?
Yeah.
Because you made this example. If someone had picked a 5, the story wouldn't work.
That's true. And that's actually an excellent example, yeah. The students in the class should think about that as well. We'll do this. There's actually at least a couple of students actually in 109 here. You'll see this example later. I might change the dollar values at that time.
So Niels Nilsson was also my mentor. So,
Excellent.
But my question is, the title of your talk was about undergraduate. Did anything you just say not apply to graduate?
Well, so like both I think on the research side and on the teaching side, in terms of the teaching side, using undergraduates as teaching assistants is relatively novel because we're pretty all comfortable with using graduate students as teaching assistants. Part of it was to think about the power of using undergraduates because it's even more of a learning experience for undergraduates to be teaching undergraduates. One of the things Eric also likes to point out is that there's this notion of a near-peer model or a stepping stone, that if a student is a sophomore and they're sitting in a section taught by a junior, it's much easier for them to see, I could be doing that next year, than if there's a grad student that they could be thinking, I could be doing that in 7 years, and then wondering why I ever got myself into this. But it's that notion that they're much closer in age, so it's easier to see that line. Same thing in research. I think the notion of research with graduate students where you work with them over a much longer period of time is a little bit different in some holistic ways than the notion of I'm working with someone for a summer, and so we're thinking about a goal that's concrete for the summer as opposed to a thesis that you're writing over X years. The teaching stuff is probably mostly the same if you apply it to lecture classes. Alrighty.
I have a question about the time dedicated to mentorship. I think over the last 3-4 years, we've seen a big increase in the number of students who want to do research, but our faculty size is the same. I think so. A lot of our faculty are struggling with kind of balance time. Do you have suggestions on, like in CS, you guys have so many students who probably want to do research. How do you handle the increasing demand? Do you just say no and keep the number of undergrads you take constant in a way of not sacrificing that mentorship, or what's your solution?
Yeah, I don't think there is a good solution. I mean, the simple solution is we need more faculty. But really, I think the distribution of faculty who take on undergraduate researchers is by no means uniform in our department. There are some who take on a lot. There are some who don't take on any at all. And part of it is, can you get other faculty who don't traditionally think about having undergraduates as researchers excited about the possibilities because they hear what undergraduates did from other faculty? So it's still resource constrained with the faculty. There isn't a good solution there. But if you can just bring more people in, that even if they're taking on 1 or 2 students as opposed to 0, aggregated over some number of faculty, that can help.
So I noticed that you use a lightsaber and candy when you're teaching. Where did you come up with that idea?
Well, the candy was something, I don't know where the candy originally came from, but it's a way, one of the things I actually sort of actively think about in lecture is, imagine there was a glass wall basically between the students in the class and you. How often does that glass wall get broken? And I think it's a shame if you can teach a whole lecture or you can teach a whole class and that glass wall never gets broken. And so part of the candy is it's just a physical way to break that glass wall, or like walking out with students or having someone come up for a demo are ways to just break that wall. And I think the more you can do that, the idea is to make something that's a big space appear like a smaller space. The lightsaber is just because it's fun. I got a lightsaber a few years ago, and there are some rooms where there's big screens or it's high up, and so you could have a pointer or a laser pointer, and I just thought lightsaber's cooler. One more question, then we probably need to wrap up.
So my question was also about the candy. I was wondering whether you had considered the possibility that some students get really stressed out by things being thrown at them in class.
I do. As a matter of fact, that's why I brought this. Because if you get stressed out by things being thrown at you, you'll really get stressed out by this. A couple of former students of mine made this because it was teaching in a big lecture hall, and I couldn't get past like row 30 or whatever. And they said, here, we're sitting in the back. And I was like, why don't you sit in the front? And they said, no, we're going to make a slingshot instead, which didn't seem like a... There are certain things I think about that. There are some students, I think of candy as sort of a fattening food. I actually have had several students in the past who they want the candy. Like one time the student came up after class and brought me like 3 or 4 candies. And I said, oh, you don't have candy, I won't throw them to you. And they said, no, still throw them. I use them to keep score. But I don't need candy, so I'll just give them back to you at the end. I was like, okay, that's interesting. The other thing I worry about is students, I actually worry about this because I have 2 little kids, students with nut allergies, because most of the candies you get actually have nuts in them. And to be honest, I don't screen for nuts. So if someone has a nut allergy, I'd say that, if you have a nut allergy, just come get a different candy later or something like that. But yeah, the projectile thing I hadn't thought too much about. But I'm a really bad shot. So it turns out this person I'm trying to actually reach with the candy is never the person I reach. It's always someone else who's not expecting it anyway. And so, yes, it's just a hazard of taking the class with me. You're sort of in the war zone. All right, thanks very much.